Hello, we are officially live. We did it. So hello and welcome to our first thing. I'm in, I don't know, I guess it's over Deboki's head, this lovely powered by StreamYard logo that's going to be over the stream. Due to how OBS doesn't want to cooperate on my computer. But it also means I'm like seeing a weird, I can see the chat, but it's not, I'm like seeing it not on YouTube. So,
is it just showing it on StreamYard? Is that?
Okay, I should have done this before. I want to tweet the thing to say we're doing it right now. That's all. So anyway, welcome to this first attempt at This Is Live Now. Come hang out with us. What? Okay, tweet. All right, sorry about that. Anyway, what was I? Oh, so this is our first attempt at this like nonfiction book club thing. So like quick, like by way of background, Deboki and I separately had like the same idea, and then talked to each other about it. We're like, all right, let's just do this.
Yeah.
And then everything that happened with the world happened.
And then it seemed important.
But now that we're just like locked in our houses, we were like, this is a great time to sit around and read nonfiction books. I will preface this by saying that Deboki is an actual scientist, and so she's going to like bring her actual smart person contributions to this when we start talking about the science books, like the hard science books. I want to put it out here that I'm not here to be any sort of like proper expert.
I'm very nervous now about this being set up as I am an expert. One of my expertise is
I just want to say I have a bachelor's degree in sociology, and this first book is like in theory a psychology book, like not. So that's more what I'm trying to say. I don't actually have a background in psych. Is really the thing that I want to say. So anyway, this first book, I guess introductions. I skipped a step. I'm Nicole Sweeney. I have degrees in sociology and communications. So that is my sort of social sciencey, like soft, very soft sciences background that I am bringing to this.
And I'm Deboki. I did a lot of bioengineering in my past. I did the grad school thing. I also double majored in English, which I always just like saying, but it was like a very nerdy, mathy kind of school. So it's like a very different kind of approach to English majors. Oh, I think my cat is chilling in the back there.
Hi.
He is also part of our discussion. But yeah, that is my background. Mostly engineering. Yeah.
So our like, I don't know, our premise, our concept, if you will, is that I'm going to pick some social science books and Deboki's going to pick some like hard science books. I think those lines are going to be probably blurrier as we proceed than we are originally conceiving of this being, but that's like our loose premise.
Yeah.
So
if there are books that other people are interested in, I'm also very open to suggestions, because I know for me with my science books, I tend to be very limited in the types of books I end up reading, and I'm very open. I think Nicole and I both were like, we just like need to learn a lot of stuff, and especially now it feels like refreshing to learn things. So like if there are other books people are interested in, I am open to a number of suggestions.
Yes, that I think is like essential to the conceit too, right? It's like two people with different backgrounds being like, here are the kinds of books that I gravitate towards and the things that I am like, naturally picking up when I'm trying to read nonfiction, and like the things that we are each gravitating towards are not the same things. And so that's like the whole point is that we are picking different kinds of things. But if you also have other things that you would like to read with us, by all means, tell us that. So anyway, the first thing we're talking about is the personality brokers, the strange history of Myers-Briggs and the birth of personality testing by Merve Emre. This book is so it's like it is. I said it was psychology. I think it's actually more fair to classify it as like history.
Yeah.
history with a bit of biography. I think that anybody who went into it expecting psychology probably is like a little bit disappointed. Like it's more of a history. It's like history of a kind of subset of psychology than it is like proper psychology. And I think that the degree to which she's working in social theory, unsurprisingly, this is part of why I liked it. The reason that the social theory that she's working in is more like the sociology of personality testing than it is the psychology of it. Before I explain the book and what the book is, just in case anybody's joining us who didn't read the book, I feel like this conversation should be followable without it. So I want to summarize the book before I do that, I feel like I should also summarize what Myers-Briggs is if you have no context for it, because the book kind of assumes you know that.
Yeah.
It assumes that you wouldn't pick it up without that context. So Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is a personality test that sorts people into 16 different types. And those 16 types are divided by 4 different binaries of introversion and extroversion, intuition and sensing, thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving. And so that's really all you need to know about like what it is. It's a personality test. But it was a personality test that was developed, thought of by a mother-daughter team, Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Meyer. So this book starts out as like a multi-generational biography, I guess. So like following Catherine Briggs, and kind of walks us through her like, interesting parenting style, interesting and very involved parenting style, and how she raised Isabel. She became something of a neighborhood darling with other parents, and also the family her and her husband lived in the DC area, and her husband worked for the government, and so there were some connections there that are like sort of loosely mentioned in the book, but I think are actually probably pretty important to have the spheres of influence that both Catherine and Isabel had access to. Anyway, so like the manner in which Catherine raised Isabel caught the attention of other parents who like came to her for advice, and she was like guiding other parents and children through what she called her cosmic laboratory of baby training. And at one point, she also, like a friend who was a journalist, invited her to write a parenting column at a time when like most of the advice and guidance about parenting was being dispensed by men. So for about a decade, she wrote a column sort of detailing all of her experiences and insights and whatnot as a parent. Later, after Isabel went away to college and got married, Catherine became, first she got super depressed because like her whole life had revolved around raising her daughter, but her new source of meaning was an obsession with Carl Jung, in particular his book Psychological Types. And when she wasn't writing erotic fan fiction about him, she began adapting ideas that she had developed around child rearing into a personality typing system, like kind of mapped onto Jung's ideas. I don't know how to phrase that correctly, but using the ideas in Psychological Types and like her own ideas about personality types being an innate and fixed concept, and using that to kind of build out a typing system. She wrote a couple articles in the New Republic, like evangelizing this idea. Eventually, Isabel, who like went through her own cycle of being a devoted wife and mother, she like wrote mystery novels. She had a whole journey all her own, and then, but similarly, kind of came back around to a similar place to her mother's, in which she, after years of being focused on being a homemaker, was like, hey, began to seek out some sort of personal and professional fulfillment. And she basically became her mother's collaborator and helped her refine the system, the sort of loose typing system that her mother had developed into a questionnaire. And then with her own access to professional spaces, first working for a man named Hay, who was selling a personality typing system to businesses, and then later, a couple other later iterations of this as well. But she refined this system into something that could be sold to businesses first, and then more broadly, like the government used it for a while. But she became she became the force that I think like crystallized it into the test. And also, while her mother was like its kind of idea generator or whatever, she was like the marketer, like the marketing force. And then I think the last, like, so we started out going through this sort of biographical thing, but the other thing that the book sort of shifts into in the last third maybe is situating like more broadly the historical context in which personality testing as a phenomenon, like outside of Myers-Briggs, mostly talking about Myers-Briggs, but like that like larger context by which like into which personality testing was happening at that time, and like the implications of that. So as workplaces were adopting these personality tests as a way to make decisions about hiring and firing, and promotions, and like schools started using it also. Schools earlier on in this, there are so many like methodological problems throughout. One of the more jarring, I've now read this book twice, and even the second time, I just like getting to the part where Isabel is just going into schools and like getting all of these records for students, and the principals are just like, yeah, sure, here you go. Is horrifying.
Yeah. What are ethics?
Yeah, ethics. Anyway, so that is this book. That's this book. I left, I'm sure, a lot of things out, but I feel like
the important stuff will come up.
Yes, we'll discuss more. Oh, okay. So I feel like I did this maybe out of order. Maybe I should have summarized the book and then explained what Myers-Briggs is, but the other sort of thing, or like by way of introduction, that we had talked about doing was talking about our own sort of background with Myers-Briggs. So I'll let you go first, Deboki.
Yeah, so the first time I ever heard about Myers-Briggs was in high school. So there's like a part in this book where there's this like clear geographical shift, where she moves from the East Coast to the West Coast, and she finds that like the West Coast people love it. And part of it, like that the book describes, are like West Coast bougie schools. And as someone who went to a West Coast bougie school, we took the test. Like, this was part of our professional development in high school. And like we did I think some kind of like official thing. We got a certificate. And so that was the first time I'd ever heard of it, was like actually like learning my type. Hey. I think like since then it's been one of those things that always comes up, like especially more recently. I feel like like in the past, I don't know, like 5 years, I've seen it come up a lot more as well. Like I remember one day in grad school, like everyone just kind of was like, hey, let's all take the 16 personalities test. And like we all did that. And like that was the fun thing to do that day. But in terms of like actually knowing about any of the history of it, or like any of the actual like underpinnings of it, this was like super new. So it was very interesting to dive into.
I first encountered the test in college. I went to an East Coast university, but I went to GW is where I went to for my undergrad, and GW is mentioned several times in this book as like so the GW medical school was the first place that one of the first places that Isabel went to. An early like testing staging ground that was like what kicked off the process by which the test was ultimately used for like medical school admissions.
Yeah.
Horrifying facet of this history. But anyway, I was first introduced to the test. I maybe had learned about it in high school, but if I did, I don't recall. But I was super involved in like student life organizations. One specifically in college that at our like annual summit where we did like big training for, like I was in all 4 years, but all the new members, you do the big training thing. We would do a bunch of different personality tests, and I like hated this. I hated it, mostly because I had a lot of early experiences of basically being typed by people. And like I did not enjoy it. Like I did not enjoy the idea of somebody else deciding that they fucking knew me. I bristled at it so intensely. However, and we did a bunch of them, not just this, but we did a lot of them. In my mid-20s, I like rediscovered it somehow, probably Vita related, I think, and like started to come around mostly because I had an experience that I think a lot of people have had with different personality tests, whether it be this one or another one, but it was like a moment of like recognition, reading something about my INFP, about my type, and being like, oh, there's like something that clicks. And so I don't know. So I went through like a brief period in my mid-20s where I was super into it, super into Myers-Briggs, and like super into the idea of like trying to understand more of my interpersonal relationships in that way. And then, I don't know, in my late 20s, I think at some point, because of the degree to which I had been reading about it, I also like started to read a lot of the justifiable criticisms of it and like its lack of validity. And so started to kind of sour a little bit. And that is the context into which I first discovered this book, was like, okay, well, now I'm curious. Like, I want to know more about that history, partially because, and I think that like the context for that history too often is like, it's these two women who didn't have any training or whatever.
Yeah.
That feels not false, but reductive. Like it's flawed. It's super fucking flawed, to be clear. Like there's a lot that is happening here that is like, yikes. But I think that a lot of the like very sort of poppy articles that I had read about that background, I was like, now that I read this book, I'm like, oh, there's like so much more.
Yeah.
So much more to it than that.
Yeah. Well, and that's like an interesting thing about the book too, because the introduction starts with just like how like cagey the organization is. So like I was like, and like I am still in a place where like I was, and this is like a very reductive way to read the book, but I was like trying to like figure out like, is this book expressing an opinion about the test? Is it expressing like some kind of judgment about the test? Or is it like sympathetic? And I think like the book itself says like that it's like trying to approach it with complexity. But I like wanted like this clear answer on like, is this test real or not? And especially with how it starts, where you're just like, why would they keep things so top secret? But then like, in terms of the criticism, you're kind of like, oh, like there is something understandable about that, but it's so connected to like, in my head, like the way like people like Goop, or not people, Gwyneth Paltrow talks about goop. And like that kind of mentality of like that protectiveness, but like worrying that there's something more insidious being protected. Like I approached a lot of that with like that kind of just like suspicion almost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that hearing you describe it in that way, so I think the Goop comparison is definitely fair. I hadn't thought of it, but like, but hearing you describe it that way is also kind of interesting to me, because I think that it makes this book actually maybe a really good one for us to have started with, because I think that it frames the like very different places that we are coming at the kinds of things that we're trying to read. So like these. Again, I think that if you came to this book expecting like psychology, you're going to be sorely disappointed. And like I wasn't, because I really don't give a shit about like the test's validity. Like it's sufficient to me to be like, people tested it, it's not fucking valid. Like it's whatever, and like move on from it. I actually don't care beyond that. I am much more interested in the larger conversations about like the theoretical. What are the social implications of this, and like what does this mean in a society? And like those are things that are not like they're squishy. There's like they are things that you can't come to hard and fast conclusions of like, is the test good or bad? Because the book really doesn't, it doesn't, I don't think, take the stance that like maybe you disagree. Maybe you feel like you did get an answer from it. I don't feel like I got an answer.
And like that's the thing, is like that was like sort of the interesting journey, especially because it was really like it took up until the last section for me to kind of fully get what I thought like the book was doing in that sense, where it really, like you're saying, it's more about thinking about what does personality testing even mean? Like I was thinking about this like against the context of like my own experience with like psychologists, which is like with cognitive behavioral therapy, which for me, like as like someone who does sometimes like categorizing things very strictly, like it's weird because personality typing, like I have, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but like I have like a lot of the same standard frustrations with like that kind of like flattening of personality down into types. But there have been times where having that kind of flattening and categorization has been like helpful for me, where like I don't need like part of CBT, like my experience of it was like at least like assigning numbers to feelings, and like feelings do not have a number. Like they are not like, there's a way to turn feelings into a thing that you could like quantifiably measure, but that is not what's happening when I am asked to do that for like in a workbook, right? And like it was still like a thing that helped me a lot. And so like at its core, like that is what this book I think is about, is analyzing what it means to have your personality type help you or help the corporation, or what that means against this backdrop of like work and like changing roles and everything that's gone on in the past century.
Yes. I have also been like sort of passively like scanning the chat. Abby, that is that context of like training to determine how we could work better together. That is like entirely the context in which I was doing all these personality tests. I actually also took a class that was about, it was like facilitating. We had a low ropes class, and so I took my senior year, I took the class that like taught you like the training to be a facilitator of the low ropes course. And so that also had a ton of like, you did like team building exercises, but mixed in with the team building exercises, a lot of personality tests, because it's like, how do you make people get along? And we can get along better if I understand that you're a sensing type and I'm an intuitive and whatever. And like, I think in those spaces and in those contexts, I do actually think there's utility, because I think it's a matter, I think like that is actually the space where when you have like whatever 8 people and they don't really know each other that well, and you just need to like help them like figure out how to get through some exercises together, giving them some really quick shorthand for, here's how this person is most likely, broadly speaking, going to come at this problem today, and here's how this person is, and like how do you meet those two things in the middle. Like I think that's fine. It doesn't, the more insidious thing, the thing that like I find more troubling about all of this is the way in which these ideas, like the idea of personality as fixed and immutable is like really, really troubling. Like I think like I find something actively insidious about that. I also find something actively insidious about the ways in which corporations use it. I think there's like a lot going on there, but sorry, I got distracted by that, because I was like, yes, that is precisely the context. I was doing it. I was being whatever given the tests. Okay, what should we do next? This guy? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. We have a little document that we're
fancy.
Guide this discussion. So having prefaced at the top that I don't have a psych background, I have the most cursory sort of background to Jung. I think we talked about him in my classical sociological theory class, which I took in the summer of 2009. So, and like his name did not come up at any other time in either my undergrad or grad studies. So that's the only context. And to talk about individuation, I think is the context in which we would have talked about him.
So for reference, like for everyone, like I know like none of the names in this book. Like I understand that Carl Jung is like a big person, but like I know like it's the same as Freud. Like I know the name, I know ostensibly like some words, but that is the extent of my experience. So I like asked Nicole, like, could you give like a little bit, just like you can give me the like the Wikipedia like intro paragraph, and that'll be like more than I've ever known. So.
Okay, so yes, the like super Googleable. Freud. He was like a near contemporary of Freud. He's like 20 years younger than him, so it was sort of like you're the one I'm maybe going to pass the baton to. But then they had a little bit of a falling out later. Not important. Individuation, that was the thing. This is the one like the Jung term that I do vaguely remember learning about in college, which I'm now just, this is like direct quote that I set aside to explain it. In general, it is the process by which individual beings are formed and differentiated from others. In particular, it is the development of the psychological individual as a being distinct from the general collective psychology. This is just like the process by which you figure out who the fuck you are. Psychological Types, which is the book, it's not the first place that he laid out these ideas, but it's the book that Catherine read. Okay, it was the book that essentially led to the Myers-Briggs type indicator. In it, he proposes 4 main functions of consciousness. So sensing and intuition, which are like non-rational, and then judging and rational thinking and feeling. And then those 2 things are modified. And this was the idea that was new, or extroverted. They're modified by attitude types, which are extraversion and introversion. And like, I think before Psychological Types, those ideas were a little bit more collapsed. But so in Psychological Types, this was the point where he said, like, at the top you have extraversion and introversion, and then from extraversion you can have like extraversion sensing, introverted sensing, extroverted intuition, introverted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Judging and perceiving are inventions of Isabel. Judging and perceiving are not from Jung. This was when Isabel was trying to like flesh this out into a system, she added those two things. But yeah, the only other thing that I think is worth noting with regards to Jung is that extroversion and introversion, he did not use those words in the ways that we tend to use them now. It was more about like like we think about those 2 things now as meaning like, do you like to be around people or not? I think is like the easiest shorthand for that. We talk about like, I get energy from being around people, and I get energy from being alone, and whatever. It is more about your orientation towards, so like extroverted people, their values, they need their values like validated by other people, and introverted people are much more concerned with like their own kind of internal. At some point in the book, actually, Isabel thinks about how the one thing that she had in common with her husband, who she eventually has like a not great marriage with, but like they're according to her, this system, I guess, the one dimension on which they're aligned is their introversion, which basically meant that when they were in college, they didn't really care what other people thought. They didn't really care about they didn't need validation from other people. And like, that is, I don't think that is how people tend to think about introversion now, but that is closer to what he was describing. And one last thing, which is that I pulled up the article. So the book mentions that Catherine, like the thing that kicked off Catherine's obsession is that she read an article in the New Republic by John B. Watson about psychological types. It was a book review of psychological types. And I don't know, I looked it up, so I'm like, New Republic, I'm sure it'll be easy to find. It's like 2 pages long. And it's just really funny to me because it is a scathing review. It is it's so funny to me because, and the book mentions this too, like kind of in passing, but that like, from Catherine's earlier days when she was in the, child development space, she was familiar with Watson. Like she had read some of his writing then. And so like with that context, she knew she was not a fan of him. So this is basically the equivalent of somebody of like reading a 1-star review from somebody you hate and being like, I want it. Yeah. I'm into that. Yeah. And I don't know. There's something so silly about it, but I find really, really delightful. The review is very funny. Just as here's my one paragraph. It is difficult for the reviewer, possibly blinded by his type, to see Jung's justification for such a classification. Only an adherent of his psychology, patched up as it is from speculations long outgrown, can feel any cogency in his reasoning. The book does not aid the science of psychology. It actually confuses it by unjustifiable and unsupported assumptions. It goes on. It's like dragging him through and through for 2 pages. But Catherine was like, I fucking hate this guy. So if this guy is the book, and like the thing is that the essential critique that Watson is making of the types is the idea that types are innate, and he's like, this is stupid, and like none of modern psychology agrees with you. You're wrong. And Catherine is like, no, but I do believe that. I do believe personality is fixed and innate. So let me go buy this 700-page book. So that I can have all of my views and beliefs confirmed. Write my erotic fan fiction, which is still my favorite detail in this book by far.
The fan fiction just like got me, like, because she like, I think that was something that was alluded to early on, like was this idea of like an erotic connection between her and Jung, and I was like, huh? And then we get to the fan fiction, and I was like, well, I mean, like, who among us hasn't, you know, like,
you know. It's great too because, like, yes, an erotic connection between the two of them. He, like, one of the things that he was like was notorious for is having inappropriate relationships with his female patients. Yeah. So like that's maybe the place that like you would expect that to go, but no, it is not that direction. Somewhere else entirely. Yeah. It was her trying to get, not only writing it, but trying to get it published, trying to get her erotic fan fiction published.
And like there was a dark side to that too, because they have this story of like him and I think like someone else that maybe they were like some other correspondent who like basically the sum total of their conversation was realizing that like he needed to have an affair with another woman because one woman is this type and the other woman is that type, which is literally just like the Madonna whore dichotomy, like typed. And it was like, yeah, it was like such a weird, dark version of that type. And like, that's such a, like to transition, I guess, like a weird underlying layer of all of this is like the gender typing or like the way that like the idea of masculine versus feminine plays out. And also like later on, a thing that was like striking to me is like the way that people process their type and who seems to be expected to change their behavior in terms of like when their type is getting in the way, like especially in a marital context, like that comes up a lot. So yeah, that was like a very weird thread.
Yeah, the marital section was super interesting for precisely that reason. That yes, there's a whole section of the book where I want to say maybe it was still Catherine, but maybe it was Isabel now. Now I forget who was doing this, who was engaging in this kind of marital counseling. But like using the system, it had to have been Isabel. But it's hard to tell because it could have been both of them. Honestly. Yeah, that's true. Especially like the ways in which they were still like so linked. Even like late into their lives was very, very interesting. But one of them was doing sort of using MBTI, whatever, to give marital advice. And they gave examples of like where one always had couples, but where one is a like thinker and one is a feeler. And like, regardless, like sometimes like the man would be the thinker and the woman would be the feeler and sometimes the other way around. But either way, the woman needed to accommodate.
Yeah, it was always in that direction. And I was like, okay. That is weird. And then it like came up in like one professional example where it was again, and like it's N equals one. Like, I don't know to the extent that this is like a consistent thing in corporate America, but like I would also not be surprised. But yeah, where it was like a female executive like had to like rethink her behavior. And I was just like, that is what a surprise.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's interesting in that the introduction to this book, where she's detailing her struggles and trying to get access to documents and whatever. But she also talks about how like there was a part of her that at one point like wanted this to be a story of like feminist triumph, and like there's a level on which like elements of that are there, obviously, like in the ways in which, like all the way to the beginning of Catherine's biography, right? Like she graduated at the top of her class, but then her parents gave a loan to her husband who was behind her in their same graduating class to like continue his studies. And like, and you see kind of this institutional sexism along the way, like throughout, and you see that continually playing out. It's like there are definitely elements of that there, but like all of that is grossly undercut by one, like the ways in which they are like actively perpetuating those same forces. So just like on a purely gender analysis level, it fails to be that. And then, above and beyond, they're also like not merely racist, but full-blown eugenicists. So like, it's you really can't get to the story of feminist triumph that maybe one might want, however briefly in their heart. So alas.
Yeah, there's and like this plays in as well, like into that idea of training, like the fact that they're not trained. And like one of my favorite moments is like Isabella like has just had her test like completely like destroyed by like someone at the ETS. Yeah. And she's like, you know, he just sounds like a person who went to grad school who like is trained to just like tear things apart. And that's how you know that they're good at grad school. It's like, I mean, like fair. Like, that is what I learned to do in grad school.
Not an unreasonable drag of students.
Yeah. And like for a second, like I was on the ETS side, like because I was like, yeah, like that is what happens to your work. But then also like recognizing like how like all of that is set up in such a like weird, like well, not weird, in a very typical like sexist angle of like these are the guys with the training because they were the people who got the training. And then like of course Catherine and Isabel were not in like a historical like context that was going to like advocate for them to get the same kind of training. Whether or not they would have wanted it is like another part, but like yes.
Well, yeah, and also I mean even the like credentialing, the book mentions too that like Catherine's first encounter, like in the early days of her fascination with Jung, it reached out to some women who were doing like Jungian analysis basically in their living rooms, and Catherine was like, wait, but why can't I just do that myself? And like at this point in time, that moment still like predated any sort of official credentialing for this by 20 years. So like even within the context in which they were existing, all of this stuff was still like, I don't know, like I think that it is relevant that we were still figuring out, like this discipline was still figuring itself out at this moment in time. I think that it's partially relevant because shit like this was a factor in how the discipline was like, oh, things like what happened with Catherine and Tucky, like that's the kind of shit, you know, not that anybody was using like that, like that discrete example, but that is the kind of thing that like born out of this moment before you had the kind of credentialing and institutions and whatnot that like were eventually created. They were part of like I think a larger, like broader landscape of people engaging with these ideas in ways that were sometimes dangerous, but also just like, you know, not intellectually rigorous, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's so rooted also in their like specific experience being mothers too, which has like always been an inexact science. Like that is. If anyone knew how to like be a mother successfully, like that would have been like distributed around the world. Like we would like, I think a lot of people would be pretty psyched about that. And so like, especially given their context, it's like the thing that kept them most occupied and most away from that kind of academic training, or if it had existed even, is the thing that also inspired their work and that like really formed the basis of it.
Right. That you don't get to the work in, and like I think Catherine more so than Isabel seemed really acutely aware of this. Like for her, it took on a like spiritual dimension too, but that like she thought about this often, this idea of like the laboratory, that, you know, like she would think back to her time in university and like in the laboratory and whatever. And at first she was trying to bring elements of that into her ideas about child rearing, but it was also, she had a really strong sense that like that was not, on some level, that was never going to capture some of the like emotional dimensions of being a parent. I think, I think that independent of all the ways that you can like ridicule her approaches, like I think that is something like very earnest and true that like was also part of it. So so yeah.
So I think related to that, and maybe transitioning to something else we were thinking about, is like that big workforce question. And like there is also a real story of like the gender roles changing at this time, where like the war has happened, women are working. Like that's a big part of Isabel's story too, is like what she was doing, like, yeah, work-wise, I guess, like, while all this was going on. And like it's not like necessarily the stereotypical like war story of like she went to a factory, now her husband's home and she's like not sure what to do. But it's like there is like that real sense of like, yeah, historical change.
Yeah, I think the historical implications are there's so much happening like culturally around this time, and I think it was like a really difficult and delicate balance that Emery had to pull in terms of how keeping the story focused while still like trying to remind readers of the broader social and cultural context for all of this. So I think like for the workforce stuff, Frederick Winslow Taylor's like studies on like factory workers and stuff is like, so that would have been happening right around the time that Catherine was still doing her like cosmic laboratories. But like those ideas about how to like regulate a workforce were like prominent then by the time that Isabel is like going out and like trying to market these ideas for how to screen and like monitor your workers and stuff.
Yeah.
All of that. And so I think, I don't know. Like, I think that it is just like, it is very interesting, like context for how and when and why all of these things are happening and the ways in which like those things shaped the arrival and like the nature of these tests, but then in turn like these tests turned around and had like a very real impact on the workforce and on the ideas about like what is appropriate, I guess. Some of my favorite parts of the book were the quotes from what's his name, something White, who wrote the Company Man, like very satirical book.
Oh yeah.
About like, I don't know, here's how you cheat at a test, and it's basically be a person with no personality whatsoever.
Yep.
I think that stuff intermixed with the Adorno stuff. So he is another one of Adorno is a social theorist who Emery mentions a lot. He, unlike Jung, is super familiar to me. This is like back in my wheelhouse. So Adorno is referenced in this book specifically because of the authoritarian personality. So if you like, just to like hook this in your brain, if you did read the book, Adorno co-authored something called the Authoritarian Personality, that it was meant to also be like a typing scale, but like it was a typing scale mostly designed to be like fuck typing scales. And like the case was that if you are super into typing, you might be a fascist, basically was the idea. And it was like how to figure out who might be a fascist, who might be like a latent fascist, was sort of the idea behind that. He had escaped, he was German and like had fled, had immigrated to the US. His whole background, he's actually, most of his writing was music criticism, but like he was very critical of most popular music because he viewed it as propping up like capitalism by making capitalism aesthetically pleasing. And like that it's sort of this is like common across like Marxist theorists in general, this idea that like you are lulling people into a sense of complacency with their submission to like a system that is exploiting them.
Mm-hmm.
That's like that kind of thing, like that's like central to a lot of his thinking. And so so Adorno comes up a bunch in this book. I think that's also part of why I loved it so much the first time that I read it, is because it was like a name that I hadn't heard in so many years, and I was like, hello. Just like on a purely personal level. But he comes up a lot in these chapters, kind of thinking through the workplace, because and maybe I latch onto them because I feel a particular level of like Yeah.
Yeah.
In this way of viewing it as being like really fucking like gross and exploitative. And that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's like this like really like this is like one of the things that I feel like I'm still teasing apart, and like which I think like the book is like the book is clear, like there's not necessarily an answer, like this is like a central issue of like does personality testing like honor the individual, or does it sacrifice it to the whole, like to the whole group? Like is it like reducing us for the sake of, I don't know, making the group work better? I don't know if I'm phrasing that correctly. It's just like this whole like idea of like what even, like if we can be encompassed into 16 personality types, like what even is an individual anymore? And like I know that the scale itself is like it's reduced to these 4 letters, but it's like there is still like a scale bar, like there is like a sense of percentage. So like if I were thinking about this in terms of like getting like pedantic about it, like it is actually kind of like an infinite set of personalities, because we at different levels of the scale. But that is, I think, more pedantic than the scale the personality testing is actually asking for. Sorry, that is like a sidetrack. But it's I don't know. I think it's like a thing that I've been trying to like tease apart is like what is it giving me as an individual? Because it clearly gives people something, and like I agree with that because there is something useful about it, but like obviously, especially when you're like putting it against this backdrop of like corporate America, it's just trying to like optimize you. Like what is that? Yeah, like are we only optimizing ourselves for the sake of this system that actually doesn't care about you as an individual? It just wants to best use you.
Yeah, and I think that it's something that the last like chapter, especially where she's walking through, like imagine you're, and and it's like a child of the 80s, and you're this and this, and then like later in the chapter, now imagine it's a millennial, like going over to this context, and like obviously reading that, it's like yes, this is my lived experience. You are correct. She starts to kind of intimate the ways in which this comes up in our like social media profiles, but she stops short of really seeing that idea through. But it is something that like I think about a lot, because I think jumping off a little bit, like what you're saying, this is I guess shifting a little bit because it's not quite the same thing as like corporations, but I think it's related. I mean, it's related because like the like Twitter and Facebook, and like the thing that they are profiting off of is the idea of our like quote unquote authentic selves. Like that's like wrapped up in like us being able to present that on that space. And like I think that all of us who have come of age in these spaces have a similar sense of what's the word, dismissiveness maybe, about that idea that people had about personality. So there's I'm backing up a little bit more in the book, late stages during one of the like, I don't know, frat houses where they were testing, doing personality typing or whatever. There's a chapter where Truman Capote in particular is a person who I distinctly remember, who was like, I'll come do this, but like, don't make me think about my personality. Like this is, that's like cheap and stupid. And like, I'm not interested in it. And I think that like, it's interesting because the word personality doesn't evoke that sensation in me, but like authenticity kind of does for like social media reasons, like that, like I feel like that same sort of attitude is also kind of wrapped up in like I think it's the same idea, but like the language has maybe shifted a little bit to where we spend so much time packaging a version of like selfhood, of personality, like that it makes it like it's confusing. Like I don't know. There are no clear easy answers. Like this level of like on the one hand, I do know like that sensation of feeling seen by some like a personality test or like a whatever. but like on the other, there is also this level of like, to what degree am I like suppressing and like shrinking myself to fit into this container, and like I like really do struggle like on a personal level with the like this being like the one of the many personality tests that I actually do feel like I like clicked with in a way. All the other ones, I'm like, no, like I can look at them and I'm like, this, you didn't get it. Like it's like, this is partially right, but then this is off and whatever. This is the one where like but like it frustrates me. It like actively bothers me because I think about the way in which I have previously been and continue to be over like a period of years attached to this particular vision of what constitutes me. And I find something really troubling in that idea. I find something really troubling in the idea that me at 26 and me at 32 are like the same. But like that to me, I think is that's not good. Like, that's not a good thing.
Does that feel like is it that you disagree with that fundamental assumption behind personality test, or you disagree that is your experience, your personality, your personal experience?
The first one. It's the first one. Yeah, it's that to me, like I think that fundamental assumption that your type isn't changing is like wrong. Like that is not how people work. Like people change. I think there's I'll have to find it. Maybe I'll link it somewhere. But there's a great study from a couple years ago, but that basically like the older people get, they do start to change less. But what really changes is their sense of themselves changing. Like the older people tend to view themselves as more, their personalities as more immutable. But like they are still the gap between how immutable they view their personalities as and like and whatever, like that actually like widens. Younger people are much more aware that they are changing. I don't know, all of which is to say like people are changing. Like the point is that like you should, like if you are not changing, if you are not reacting to this, like the fucking inputs of your life, like that to me feels that feels like a failure of being a person. So I don't know.
I have this memory from grad school. I think I did like 2 non-MBTI personality-ish type tests. One was like a very simple, like communications oriented one. And it was like, I went to this seminar because it was supposed to be about communication. I was like, sure, I probably like could learn something. And then I showed up and it was like, categorize yourself along 2 axes. And one was like how direct or indirect you are. And I think the other is like whether or not you like say everything. I forget what the other one was, but it was like, I don't know, basically like whatever it was, I ended up on the side where like you're very direct, borderline, like people think you're an asshole. But like, I don't know. It was weird. It was like, maybe not. I might be like stretching what the test actually said. But we ended up in that room.
Like, that's called me an asshole.
Basically, you could be a bitch, asshole. Like these are your personality types. The new MBTI. But I think like we had like, because this specific test was about communication, we were trying to argue with the person in the who was running, or like some of us were arguing with the person who was running the seminar about like, how could you actually reduce our communication personality type to one thing? Because there are very clear ways that I communicate differently, like at work versus like at home. Like I would be like direct in a specific way that I am at work, and like might be less like, I don't know, scattered at work, whereas at home, like I probably say like a lot more of the things that just come to my head because I'm just kind of like, whatever, like this is my home, I can say whatever I want. Like, and like the person running it was like so adamant that like, no, you have one communication style and that is the only one. And that was like really weird. And like, obviously that's like just that specific instance, and like that, where that kind of idea of like, that immutability is like very disturbing. I don't know really where I'm going with that. I just like have that like such a vivid memory of that like really for me was like one of the first times that I really thought about like how flattening these kind of personality type things can be. I think because that was like 4 things that were just about communication, which is like such a nuanced thing. Like that was what was so weird about it.
Yeah, well, and I think I think that this like problem of flattening is also interesting. I think drawing this all the way back to kind of like the beginning of this conversation, but like I think that the way that a lot of this like social theory works, like in the way that it is intended as models, and versus the way that it then like it also it undergoes this flattening in like pop communication that I think is also kind of there's like an interesting tension around this, because you want to, like, social theory especially like wants to become accessible, like it is there's a strong imperative for it to be that, but it also like it tends to become distorted like as soon as that happens. And so then like I think that the whatever the many flaws were like with Jung and whatnot, and I don't know again that much about his work, but I think that it's like there are layers of flattening here, like so like what Catherine was doing with his work was not really particularly true to it either, right? So she is flattening it, and then you can see her frustration with Isabel. Like she gets mad at Isabel for what Isabel is doing because she views Isabel as flattening it. And then like in the last chapter of the book, Emre is asking like how might Isabel feel about the sort of pop language that has arisen around this, and the way that people talk about it and use it, and like Emre's conclusion is that she probably would have felt emboldened by the existence of true believers, and that probably would have been enough for Isabel. But you can see in that like a further flattening, like there's layers of like, what was proposed, like the starting point, like off over there was here is like a model for understanding personalities. Like here's just sort of like a broad, like loose, like way in which you can think about types of people, and then like Catherine tried to codify that into something more specific, that like people are this and they are super innately this, and it is going to be like my life's work to understand how to type all the people around me. And then Isabel further took that and was like, oh yes, I will give everyone a 4-letter code. Everyone has a 4-letter code, it's innate to them, whatever. And then you see that like extended to med schools deciding who gets to be a fucking doctor because of their 4-letter code.
That's really interesting. I didn't think about like I was thinking about in the last step of like, because like Emre makes it like super like explicit, like that last step of like the transition to pop psychology today. But I didn't think about like this long chain of like transmitting this information, because it's like making this about something that it's not, but like it just makes me think a lot about science communication and science writing in general, because that is like such a huge problem. Like how do you make something that can match the rigor of the original work but still be accessible to people? And I think Catherine probably didn't really care. Like I don't think that's what she was doing. Like that's not a problem she was facing. Isabel might have been more, because she was actually thinking about like how to commercialize this process a little bit, but even she obviously also has her resistance to like what it means, like,
and especially because she didn't share Catherine's attachments to Jung in the first place. Like I think that's the disconnect. Like Isabel, given the rest of her disposition, if she had shared that attachment to Jung, maybe she might have felt differently, but like without it, yeah.
Huh. That is, that's super interesting.
This, I have my like I don't know, like slight pet interest in this. Is like a very specific example of a phenomenon that I think happens pretty broadly across. So social science tends to, they use like words like that are words, and it's like it's a person uses a word that is a word that most succinctly describes the thing that they're writing about, right? But then like it becomes a thing where like that word takes on a very specific discrete meaning in a social science context. This isn't what I was about to say, but it does. I had the thought. I remember performativity is specifically a Judith Butler gender studies term. Another book, actually, another theorist that this book mentions a little bit is Goffman, Irving Goffman, who had this basically his whole thing is like person or identity as a performance that you're performing in different sort of contexts. It allows for the kind of like code switching that you were talking about. Code switching would not have been his term either. He's writing before that, but regardless, like that sort of thing. And I, in like early days of talking about Goffman, would use the word performativity and like would get in trouble with professors. Like, no, you can't fucking say performativity now, even though like he's talking about performing self, but performativity discreetly goes over there. The example I was going to bring up is emotional labor. This is like a personal like pet like thing I have a lot of feelings about. Is emotional labor is also one of those terms that like it has a very discrete sociological meaning. Arlie Hochschild, who coined the term in the 80s, was talking very specifically about professional capacities in which jobs typically occupied by women, where some part of their labor, the thing that they are being paid for is their emotions, that they are being paid, usually service sector jobs, that you are being paid to be happy. Like you're not just being paid to perform a task, you are also being paid to be happy. I think this idea is more ingrained. Like I think in the early 80s when she was writing this idea was a lot more novel than it is to people now. But like the Twitter discourse around like performing emotional labor for your friends, you can't. It's not labor. It's not if it's not like whatever. I mean, that it's more nuanced than that. I will say, like, because I think that there's like a separate conversation about the ways in which like in a household, like household labor, like that gets muddier about what does not constitute labor in a household. But like between friends, there's no fucking labor involved. Like that's not how this works. It's not emotional labor. It's something else. But like, I say that with all of my like pedantic sociology feelings, but like also at the same time, like language, this is how like language and like ideas work too, is sort of a separate thread that like, it means something different now. Like the idea has taken on a sort of like cultural prominence that has changed it and shifted the implications of it. So
that's actually like sorry, I'm still taking us further away from the book now, but we will return. At some point we'll return. But like that idea of like jargon, like I think about this a lot in the context of like things that like I read this book recently that was like about microbes that I really enjoyed, except I hated its approach to jargon. And this is a thing that I have like been trying to like sort out my feelings about in terms of how science writers talk about scientists and like how we talk about jargon, because I think jargon is super cool. In our context, like in the case of hard sciences, it's not that idea necessarily of a word being like misappropriated, like outside of the context that it originally was created. It's more like that reluctance to use jargon because you feel that you're going to like alienate the reader if you're like using a super technical term, which I'm always like, I understand it. And like, I don't have a clear answer for like what I'm processing fully yet. But I love jargon. Like, I think it's the coolest thing because it basically feels like every time I've taken classes that were like in other fields, you learn like a whole new language. Like the way people talk about a thing, like fundamentally like is different. And they're often in related fields. Like the way that I talked about biology as a bioengineer is different often than the way that molecular biologists who are working from a slightly different, like we're working with the same things, but we're approaching it with different angles. We have like a slightly, like it's almost like a dialect kind of to me. I don't know how like the linguists would define it, but like that's how it felt. To me. And so it's interesting that like for us, like on the hard science end, it's like the reluctance to use jargon, whereas like on the sociology end, it's this like co-opting of the jargon that's like very tough.
Yeah, because the jargon is not like innately jargon. Like it's the other like almost inverse relationship to jargon. Yes, totally. Yes. This is very interesting. I just realized that we've cleared an hour. So I like by way of like maybe kind of wrapping up, briefly tying this back to the book, you added a question to our doc that I think is really interesting and like it is a good note to end this on before we announce our next book. For anybody who's still with us. The big question is like, what is it about the idea of types that appeals to us?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the obvious, I think the stereotype of the scientist makes it seem like types should be a thing that a scientist loves because it involves categorization, and like that idea of just like sorting things neatly. But I've talked to like a lot of people like from the same background as me, where I think the opinions of it range. But there is like this idea that like somehow like once I know this thing about me, I will know myself. Except there's like a weird thing too, where sorry, like, the cycles of weirdness to me are like you plug in this information about yourself into a model, and then the model tells you things about yourself that are based on the things that you plugged in, and then we're always like surprised by the fact that it revealed the thing that we put in.
Yes,
like
yes.
like I told the model that I like to like talk to people sometimes, and then it tells me you like to talk to people sometimes, and I'm like, oh, it figured me out. It knew everything. But there is definitely like one thing. So like when I took the MBTI in high school, I measured I got ENTP and like all, I don't know, to me, like when I read it, I'm like, yeah, sure, that makes sense. But the thing that was like, has stuck with me is that I measured in very, very much midway on the extraversion introversion scale, because I had been surprised that I was extroverted. And like, it was like, oh, really? You're like 1% to 2% like on the extroverted side. And that has actually been a thing that's really stuck with me and been kind of like revelatory, is like, oh, that actually kind of explains something to me about myself that I didn't fully understand at that time. I was also like 16, like I don't know anything, but it's been something that's been useful to me in terms of like how I process conversations about introversion and extroversion that like dominate now. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a similar so I also test similar. So I pretty much always get I, but I'm like, it's like 51-49, like that's super super close. The one I have like a related experience, but it's with my N, like N over S, intuition over sensing, but it's like aggressive. That is the one that I'm like, it's like 95/5. Any of the questions that are about that, I always pick the intuition answers. And I had like a similar sort of like, I don't know, realization of like that it was like a communicative flaw of mine, like a thing that I have to be mindful of, that I deal so like naturally in abstraction. Like that was my big takeaway, was that this is a problem that I have, that like a thing that I need to be more mindful of, that like and it came up actually really in the conversation of this book almost early on, that sort of dichotomy, the way that whatever Myers-Briggs thinks about that dichotomy, I guess, is like, I think reflected in my deep ambivalence for, I didn't want any more pages about how the test isn't valid. I don't care. Tell me it's not valid. Great. I can move on. I want to think about like the ideas of society or whatever.
Yeah.
And like, I had a similar experience of it. Was like, this is something that is meaningful to me, and like I do feel like I learned something useful about myself, whatever my issues, my larger issues are with like this idea of typing. I appreciate that. I don't know, and I think that is the thing that like draws people to it. I think it's that experience of being like, I do feel like I understand something about myself a little bit better, and like I have gained information that I can take forward into the world, into being a person, however dubiously bought that information.
Like one thing I was like surprised by, like in the examples that she gave in the end, that Emery gave at the end, of like the ways that personality type tests are like now like just like a BuzzFeed quiz. I was really surprised, especially given how often this book references like literary personalities.
She was an English professor, by that's her actual background. So that's why they're so like.
And it was a really interesting connection. But I was really surprised that when she was talking about millennials, she didn't bring up Harry Potter house sorting, because to me that is like the preeminent personality typing. That like, and I know people like say like read another book, but like let's face it, like Hogwarts houses was like for so many people, and still continues to be, a way that people define their personality, to the extent that like, of all the things that J.K. Rowling has done, like sometimes what rubs people super wrong are the ways that she, in their view, misapplies the housing system that
Yeah,
she
yeah,
designed.
yeah.
And like I have like my own issues with the Hogwarts houses. I did have an interesting experience though, where one time I did like a live journal sorting community, and I was like, oh, they're like, you put like answer the survey, and like everyone is gonna vote on what they think you are. And I'd like spent my whole life thinking I was a Ravenclaw. I'm like, I'm a nerd, like whatever. And then like they were like, no, you're a Slytherin, and that was like actually like deeply revealing. I was like, I have never thought about that, but that actually makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Yeah. Like, and that like that is the personality test that has like told me more about myself than I think I was ready for. But it's like that in astrology, like these like very like that is another personality like typing. It's not a test, obviously.
Yeah.
But the way that people like now treat like co-star and astrology, and like people now know like all of the parts of their sign that I'm still unclear on, and like what that means. Another question that this book made me think about, and I don't know if I'm like oversimplifying history here. There's a lot in this, like you were saying, like the authoritarian personality. There's a lot like in response to the rise of fascism. There's pandemics. There's war, and like the parallels to a lot of stuff that's happening now are like very clear. And in a way, whereas like, is this connection to like this is the popularity of astrology, MBTI memes, enneagrams? Enneagrams. Like, is the popularity of that connected to like, I don't know, whatever same impulse drove personality testing then too?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, a measure of like creating order, and like, oh, that is a very interesting question for which I do not have any good.
Yeah, I would have raised it earlier, but I feel like the answer to me is like I don't know.
No, man, but it's an interesting thing to think about. The like Harry Potter astrology thing is so interesting to me. The Harry Potter thing, I have like a very strong attachment to. It was my like master's thesis was basically about this. The ways in which people were OG Pottermore. Pottermore has undergone so many iterations now that people don't feel the same way about it that they did at the beginning. But in the beginning, all people who were beta testers, like there was such a strong sense that whatever Pottermore told you was correct, that I found this so fascinating and so confusing. Like I still find this idea so fucking confusing to me, that a 22-year-old who was like raised on these books and like who like I understand like the attitude that you've described about the way in which people get mad that she's like misbuying the houses, that I understand. Like that to me, that impulse makes sense. If you spent 20 years thinking about these fucking books, like you have really strong convictions about the houses. Like that checks out. I understand that. In a way that I do not understand the idea that you like spend all this time thinking about a conception of yourself, and then this quiz, like, I don't know, because it has her backing, you're like, wow, then I guess I was wrong about myself and I'm actually this. I find that fascinating. I found it like, I wrote a whole paper about it because I had so many feelings, like trying to make sense out of this idea that I found and continue to find sort of vexing. I would be curious actually to see what I would find if I like it was like of a moment, so it would be kind of impossible to replicate now. But like I think it would be different. I think that like attitudes towards her in her own
I think like it would be more of like if she put her stamp on it, you're like
it's not so I don't know, whatever. Okay, we're rambling. Let's bring it home. Miriam, it's not good. You don't want to read it. It's not. No.
You should. One day we'll book club your thesis. We can share. You can read my thesis. It's really boring and not interesting. So.
Well, anyway, speaking of our book club, what are we reading next time, Deboki?
So next time we're going to read this book, Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angela Saini. This is a pretty recent release. This is a pretty recent release, I think within the last year or two, that's about the science, I guess, underlying how how people have talked about race, or not how people have talked about race, the science that people have used to justify their views of race, and how even people who are very smart and maybe even not trying to be racist, even though obviously a lot of people are trying to be racist, but also there are ways that like unintentionally people are bringing racism into their science because we have a very shoddy understanding of race at a scientific level. I saw Angela Saini give a talk related to this book, and it was super interesting and like really made me rethink a lot of the ways that I've thought or talked about race in terms of like a scientific thing. So I'm really excited to dive into this book.
So that's it. And then we're doing this next month. Second Saturday seems to be, this is what we're going to try for. I guess in both of our announcement videos, we said we were doing this every other month. That's still kind of true because will be on our own channels every other month is what will happen. That thing that I said, that's how that will be true. But we're actually going to do, because the world has changed and we're in our houses all the time, we feel that we have more time to read books.
And also that it would be really nice to just talk with each other about these books.
The longest conversation I've had all week. So,
that's why we had so many things to talk about.
So
sorry, Kathy. The title is Superior: The Return of Race Science. So maybe we'll post it, write it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm copying it into the chat right now. So we will also obviously share it on our, I assume that you are all our, it's basically the chat seems like it's a lot of our friends. Seems to be what's going on here. So I assume we're all, Twitter buddies. We'll obviously talk about it there. Whether or not you had to do a thesis, you are not going to write one as an undergrad. That is very interesting. That was, and as an undergrad, I did not do a thesis. My grad program had a split where like there were a lot of, you could take like theory classes and practicum classes. I hated the practicum classes. Like I felt like they were a waste of my time, and I just like was not interested in them. But then at the end of the program, you could either do, because it was a comms program, so at the end of the program, you could either do a thesis, and like it was like it like tracked pretty cleanly that like if you kept taking the theory classes, you were going to write a thesis, or you could do an internship. And at the end of the internship, you had to write like a 40, 50, I don't know, really, it was like 40, maybe a 60-page paper about your internship. And all of my friends who did that, they were just like, I don't know how you, like I was an intern for a semester. I don't know what you want from me. 60 pages. Yeah. I was a fucking intern.
It was like triple spaced, 2-inch margins.
Anyway, sorry. So we're gonna do this every other month. That was every other Saturday.
I am not gonna have a full book read.
Maybe if we're still a year from now, we're still in lockdown. We're like, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think our conversation has been like, we sent each other, we were like, hey, we should do this. And then things started going into lockdown. It's like, hey, we should do this now. And then we were like, hey, we should do this more frequently than we originally said. So who knows?
Who knows? For right now, the plan is that we're doing this every other month, the second Saturday, even numbered months here, odd numbered months over there. Yeah. So we will see you guys on May 9th.
Yeah.
At the same time, 5 p.m. Eastern time, to talk about Superior.
Yeah. Thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah. Okay. Bye. End it.